At the age of 18 to 19, I used to pick up hitchhikers and go hitchhiking myself. The 1990s felt a bit different to now. One day I was traveling from Edinburgh to back home. It was about 70 miles. I saw a fella hitchhiking a ride just outside of Edinburgh city limits with a sign saying, "No, you seem to have loads of stuff." Most went in the trunk, some in the back seat. You jumped in the front, and off we went. He seemed quite awkward, and his accent was all over the place. German, French, English. It felt forced. Though small talk was difficult, he looked punk or alternative. And so we will have music in common. Let's talk about music. I thought he was wearing an Exploited t-shirt, which is a local band. I asked if he saw them all in Edinburgh as they played 2 days before, said he hadn't heard of them. Okay, I thought the more we talked, the more uneasy I felt and the more he seemed to relax. He had a bunch of piercings, which he started talking about and said he'd done them himself. They looked at each one with squint and looked brand new. He started telling me about how he'd been spending the last year or so, which sounded somewhat off-grid in terms of living. We've been traveling around Europe on a motorcycle he built himself, fair enough. I worked as a mechanic at that point in life, so I asked about the setup. He got irritated and changed the conversation. He then got on to how a monk had found him half dead in a field and nursed him back to hell. He then worked at the monastery to repay his debt, and it sounded like something out of a movie. This bizarre story lasted 30 or so minutes. Through the monastery story, he kept saying there's no need to pull that face, and getting quite aggressive. I mentioned, it doesn't really make sense, as you've jumped around 4 countries. And I'm also driving and trying to listen to a German accent. He then freaks out and starts smashing his fists on the dashboard, screaming, how he wants out fair play. We are almost there as soon as I slow down to a give. Wayside, he jumps out of the car, flings the doors opener, grabs his staff, and walks off, leaving the doors open. I get out to close the doors and say, sorry to the people behind me who had to wait and witness this. I look over to see where he's going, and he was climbing a fence and heading into a farmer's field. I was a little freaked out and just wanted to get home. My mom knew something was wrong the minute I walked through the door, so I told her the story. She suggested I check the car in case he stole anything and phone the police. Yeah, he forgot some bags. Great. I phoned the police and left details, and I forgot about it for a couple of days or so. Then I woke up to my car window smashed and the bags were gone. It was a hard sinking moment. I found the place again, and this time they turned up and took a statement. I dropped him about 12 miles from where my parents lived, so I wrote it off as a coincidence. 6 months later, I see a Crime Watch episode where they have the "Have you seen this person" section. Guess who it was? Looking like a suit wanted across Europe for very bad things, entered the UK under false documents, thought to have changed his appearance, and attacked people in a car after they picked him up hitchhiking. That was the second heart-sinking moment. Apparently, the punk rock look was a disguise. I've never picked up a hitchhiker since. Part 4. Myself and my buddy Todd were driving through a town we live in. It's in Iowa. It was 12 or so at night, and we were smoking lots of weed. He's only 15, and I'm 19 at this point. The reason he was driving is that I'm quadriplegic, and I can't drive myself. The subwoofer I installed was pounding. In fact, we were so tuned into the music that we didn't notice the streetlights were suddenly not working where we were driving. My buddy looks back at me and asks for a song. I look up to ask what he's saying just in time to see a man lit up like a deer in headlights. He wasn't normal. He had on khakis and looked like a presentable older man with blonde hair. Here's the creepy part. His thumb was straight out to his side like he was hitchhiking, and he had an ungodly grip that shouldn't be possible. We swerved all the way from the right lane across to the middle lane, then into the left in a matter of seconds, and we somehow managed to not scratch my vehicle. We both look back, and I tell Todd to get us gone. We never saw anything on the news, and I even alerted the police. The creepiest thing was it looked like an aged version of a mutual friend between us. This was only a few months ago, but I swear I still see things sometimes. Part 5. Okay, so let me take you back to a weird encounter I had with this hitchhiker. My brother and I were going to our grandparents' house. The road we took was pretty scenic, and it isn't a usual road people take to go where we're going, since there are easier and faster ways. As we drove past a certain road, there was this guy wearing really busted-looking flannel jeans, shoes, and a cap. At first, we just thought he was going to get picked up by someone since hitchhikers aren't a big thing from where I'm from. Anyway, my brother looks at me and says, "You reckon we should help her?" Me, being the crime junkie I am, shook my head and said, "Nah, he's probably waiting for someone specific." We arrived at my grandparents' and had a good time there. The time we left was probably around 10 p.m., and it was pretty dark already. My brother took the same way back, as we just like the views and longer drives. He was trying to be funny and drive really fast. As he did, we literally zoomed past the same man. I told him to go back since it's been like 3 or 4 hours since we last saw him. My brother hesitated at first, but then did. A U-turn. When we got back to the guy, we asked if he wanted a ride, and he said yeah. He told us where he wanted to go, and we said sure, why not? We're going to go past there anyway. When he got into the back seat, the first thing we noticed was the smell. It reeked. Then when I offered him a water bottle, he took it. He didn't look homeless or anything, so I didn't suspect that he was. But I did notice he had a hell of a lot of scratches on his arms. I brushed it off and just kept looking at the road. The drive was silent. When we arrived where he said to go, he hopped out of the car. My brother decided to wait until he went into the house. When we waited, the guy looked back and just stood there. I got a bit uneasy and told my brother to just drive off. He ended up doing so, but I feel so guilty that maybe something bad had happened and it was our fault. So for the next 3 weeks, I kept checking for any news around that area, but nothing popped up. I even asked officers to do a wellness check there, but they couldn't, as I didn't actually know anyone there personally. So yeah, that was my little experience with a weird hitchhiker. When I was a kid, my parents were possibly strict. I was never given much opportunity to do things with my friends because my mother was confident that I'd end up doing drugs or having sex and whatever else her imagination could conjure up. The exception were a few Asian friends. My mother, a Thai woman, was inherently trusting of girls who were foliage and was less strict about my spending time with them. And so it happened that one day, Lynn, a Chinese girl with 2 Chinese parents, invited me to the mall, and my mother actually said yes. She even gave me $20 for the box, lunch, and maybe even a little something nice. Unfortunately, when I got to Lynn's house, she sadly announced that some family had showed up unexpectedly and she wouldn't be able to go. To describe my disappointment would be impossible. I was 14, and this was supposed to be the first real outing without my parents I'd ever embarked on, and here I was being told it wasn't going to happen. As she went back inside, I walked away, trudging back towards my house. But as I walked, the idea hit me. Why not just go myself? I had the money. I could just get on the bus by myself and go to the mall. It started off staggeringly successful. I managed to catch the right bus, got to the mall, and wandered around. I had my first real burrito experience, played games in the arcade, and bought leather goddesses of Phobos. I was having the time of my life. It was getting dark, so I decided it was time to head back home. I got on the bus, paid my fare, and told the driver where I was headed. The driver shook his head and informed me that he didn't go that far. What's more, I caught the last bus leaving the mall for the day, and that by the time he got me to the transfer station to catch the right bus, the buses would be done running. I put on a brave face and asked him how close he could get me. He described a spot about 2 miles from my house, so I agreed that it was fine. He dropped me off where we discussed, which happened to be outside a Dunkin' Donuts. Being that it was February and that I was woefully underdressed for any significant amount of time outside, I went inside and bought myself a hot cocoa. Armed with my cocoa, I started the trek home. About a quarter mile into the walk, I approached an area that had always given me a little pause. It was just beyond the railroad tracks. In fact, it was the area my mind always conjured up when someone used the phrase, the wrong side of the tracks. There was even a strip club on the corner and a few rundown houses. I was determined to be brave, though, and continued on resolutely. Just as I crossed the tracks, an oncoming red Econoline van slowed to a stop, and the driver rolled down his window. He gave me a friendly smile and said, "Hey, sweetheart, need a ride?" Now, I may have been a dumb 14-year-old who hadn't had enough sense to realize that going to the mall alone in the first place was a bad idea, but I knew with every fiber of my being that taking a ride from strangers, and this particular stranger especially, was a very bad idea. I tried to smile casually and wave vaguely at a house nearby. "Nah," I said, "I just live over there." They looked back at the direction I was indicating, looked at me and shrugged. "All right," he said, "but it's awfully cold out here." I just laughed and waved goodbye. He pulled away and drove off. Moments later, though, he drove by again, having apparently pulled a U-turn somewhere behind me. Just seeing this van again made my heart skip a beat, but he drove past me without slowing or even looking at me. He turned the corner, and I breathed a sigh of relief. As I rounded the corner, though, my heart dropped. He was parked in the strip club's parking lot, with his van pulling backwards so that it faced the street, his parking lights off. I couldn't see through the windshield, but I tried to act like I hadn't even noticed it. I tried to act casual. I was already rounding the corner, but once I saw it, I tried to inconspicuously change routes and act like I was headed for the house across the street. I calmly walked around the back of the house, as if I maybe lived there, and just stood there trying to listen for signs of him driving away. I was terrified, however, when I saw headlights lighting up the driveway that ran alongside the house, and sure enough, he drove his van slowly into view. I was frozen in fear. He reached the end of the driveway and turned around slowly, heading up. I could see him looking in my direction, but I couldn't tell if he'd actually seen me or not. As soon as he started up the driveway again, I forced my legs into motion, ran around the other side of the house, and fled onto the porch, where I hid for what seemed like hours. I prayed someone would open the door and find me, but I was too afraid to actually knock on the door and ask for help. Eventually, half frozen and scared, and knowing that it was starting to get late and my mother was going to start wondering where I was, I peeked over the railing and scanned for any sign of him. I didn't see any, so I started running home. I still had over a mile and a half to go before I got home, and even at 40-degree F, I couldn't sustain a run very long, especially in my half-frozen condition. The walk seemed to take forever, and at every sign of a vehicle larger than a car, I hid behind a tree or bush. The entire time I was mapping getaway routes. If he caught up to me here, where would I go? I can honestly say I've never been so terrified in my life. Less than a mile from home, I saw a large vehicle headed towards me that seemed to have the same headlights as an Econoline. My heart just plummeted, and I dove behind a bush. That I didn't pee myself when the driver slowed down is a wonder. I heard the window go down, and amazingly, blissfully, I heard my mother's voice say, "Julie." I stood up, and there she was in our Ford Bronco, staring at me with confusion. I think I went from behind the bush to inside the car in a single bound. I caught some serious hell that night for being stupid and everything, but hell never felt so good because the entire time, I could only think about what might have happened.